The desert sun burned over Persepolis, turning the palace courtyards into blinding plains of gold and shadow. Inside the marble halls, where carved lions watched in silence, a man knelt before the throne, trembling, bleeding, and bound. His name was Artabanes, once a commander of the royal guard, now branded a traitor. He had been accused of conspiring against the great king, whispering with rebels from the western provinces. And in Persia, betrayal was not punished with simple death. It was purified. The royal chamber smelled of myrrh and iron. Soldiers stood in perfect silence, their spears glinting like shards of the sun. Artabanes tried to speak, but the guards forced his head down. The chief executioner, a tall man draped in black, stepped forward carrying a bronze bowl. Behind him, slaves tended to the furnace, a pit of glowing embers where a crucible sat, filled with molten lead. It shimmered like liquid lightning, the air above it writhing with heat. When the king rose from his throne, all others bowed. His robes were white, embroidered with gold, and his voice carried through the hall like a cold wind. A soldier who drinks the words of rebels must be cleansed by the fire of truth, he said. Let his body bear witness to divine order. Artabanes raised his head. Sweat and blood streaked down his face. I served you faithfully, he cried, his voice cracking. It was your courtiers who lied, your scribes who forged my name. The king said nothing. His eyes, rimmed with kohl and shadow, were as still as carved stone. He turned his gaze to the executioner and nodded once. The ritual was to begin. The guards dragged Artabanes forward to the furnace. The smell of burning oil filled the air. His mouth was forced open with an iron hook. He struggled, thrashing against his restraints, but his strength was fading. He had been beaten for days. The executioner lifted the ladle, its tip glowing white-hot. As the liquid metal poured, the hall filled with a sound that froze the hearts of every man present, a hiss, a scream, and the sound of flesh meeting molten fire. The lead entered his mouth like a serpent of flame, spilling through his throat, burning its path until silence fell. The body convulsed once, twice, and then lay still, smoke curling from his lips. The ritual was complete. The courtiers turned their eyes away, but none dared to move. The executioner poured the remaining lead onto a slab of stone. Where it hardened into a dull gray crust, the metal transformed from liquid fire to lifeless ash. Purified, he said, placing the solidified piece before the throne. The king's priests gathered to chant, calling upon Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, to cleanse the empire of corruption. Their voices echoed through the hall, rising and falling like waves. Outside, a crowd had gathered. The doors were open, and the soldiers lifted the corpse for all to see, a reminder to those who whispered rebellion. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Traders and peasants watched in silence as the smoke drifted toward the setting sun. The day would be remembered not for the rebellion crushed, but for the horror witnessed. The punishment of molten lead was not common. It was reserved for those whose betrayal was considered an offense to both king and divinity. The Persians believed that metal, born from the earth's deepest fires, carried divine purity. To pour it into a traitorous body was to burn away deceit, to force truth into his soul, even in death. The ritual's origins were ancient, older even than the Achaemenid dynasty itself. Priests of the old faith wrote that long before Darius and Xerxes, kings used molten metal in ceremonies of justice, not merely to kill, but to display the power of the divine through suffering. Those who watched were meant to feel fear and awe, to know that the gods themselves demanded loyalty to the empire. But beneath the divine facade, the act was political, a display of terror disguised as righteousness. The kings of Persia ruled vast lands, stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, filled with conquered peoples who whispered of freedom. Fear was a weapon stronger than any spear, and molten lead was its sharpest edge. Artabanes' death set ripples through the empire. His family was stripped of wealth and name, his estate seized. His friends, once proud officials, vanished into dungeons beneath the royal fortress. Yet the rebellion he was accused of aiding, the quiet unrest in the western provinces, did not disappear. The more the king punished, the more fear spread, and with fear came hatred. Whispers filled the taverns and markets of Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana. They said the great king had grown cruel, that even his loyal soldiers trembled to speak his name. Some claimed they had seen the furnace kept burning in the palace courtyard, a symbol of unending vigilance. Others swore the king slept poorly, haunted by the faces of those who had died under the fire. There were accounts from travelers, Greek mercenaries, scribes, and spies, who told of executions carried out in secret chambers, where molten metal was poured not only into the mouths of traitors but into their ears and eyes. The ears, one Greek chronicler wrote, for they refused the truth; the eyes, for they beheld forbidden things. Yet among the Persians, the ritual was rarely spoken of aloud. It was taboo, both sacred and feared. Even those who performed it believed they risked impurity by witnessing it. Some priests later wrote that each drop of lead that entered a man's body carried a curse upon the land if unjustly used. To kill the innocent by molten metal was to offend the gods themselves. Still, the empire's rulers used it when they wished to make an example so terrible that no one would dare repeat the crime. In one later account, a court historian described another execution. A woman this time, accused of passing military secrets to the enemy. Her punishment was the same, though the priests added a cruel twist. Before the lead was poured, she was made to drink salt water until she could no longer breathe. Then, when her body convulsed, they poured the molten metal, calling it the cleansing of voice and spirit. Such stories were meant to die in silence, buried with their victims. But travelers carried them west, where the Greeks and later the Romans recorded them in their chronicles, sometimes as horror, sometimes as awe. The image of molten metal as divine punishment would echo through centuries of execution lore, from ancient empires to medieval inquisitions. And yet, beneath all the blood and fire, something human remained, the sound of a scream echoing through stone halls. The moment when pain became message and death became mourning. In the years following the death of Artabanes, the furnace in Persepolis cooled, but the memory of its heat lived on. The palace guards who had stood witness never spoke of it again. One by one, they were reassigned to distant provinces or retired in silence, haunted by the memory of that hiss, molten lead striking flesh, a sound too unnatural for human ears. Even the priest who had blessed the ritual fell ill, his voice reduced to a whisper. Some said the gods had punished him for blessing cruelty under the name of purity. Others believed he had simply gone mad from what he had seen. The great king himself aged quickly after that. His hair turned white, and his dreams became tormented by visions of men melting into silver light. It was said that, at night, he would order all fires extinguished in the palace. Unable to bear the sight of flame, yet still he ruled by fear. The molten lead execution became legend, a hidden ritual reserved only for those whose crimes struck at the empire's heart. But history is never kind to tyranny cloaked in divine law. When Darius' successors took the throne, the empire began to crumble under the weight of its own rituals. Conquered peoples rose in defiance, armies weakened, and within generations, the fires that once symbolized divine justice flickered into memory. The Greeks came, led by Alexander, and with their conquest came a different kind of cruelty, efficient, militarized, yet draped in philosophy and reason. Still, even among the Greeks, tales of Persia's molten lead lingered. Aristotle himself is said to have mentioned the punishment in private writings, calling it a perversion of purification, the body as vessel for the god's rage. Later Roman chroniclers took it further, describing how molten gold and silver were used against traitors and corrupt officials, a macabre echo of the Persian rite. Centuries later, medieval scribes, translating ancient texts by candlelight, came across the descriptions and recoiled. To them, the punishment seemed almost mythical, a blend of divine terror and human invention. But it wasn't myth. Archaeological digs near Susa and Persepolis uncovered bronze cauldrons blackened by centuries of heat and traces of metal fused into stone. These relics, silent and cold, bore witness to the empire's ritual of molten fire. The deeper truth, however, was philosophical as much as physical. The Persians had believed that purity required suffering, that to restore cosmic balance, pain must become sacred. The molten lead, pouring like light from the earth's heart, was meant not merely to destroy but to cleanse, to burn away lies, to seal truth in silence. But as the centuries passed, humanity repeated the same ritual in new forms, different tools, same logic. In the Inquisitions of Europe, priests poured boiling oil onto flesh, calling it a trial by ordeal. In Asia, molten metals reappeared in dynastic courts as punishments for betrayal. In the New World, colonizers revived it under new gods and new banners. Each time, the justification was purity, law, or divine willed. Each time, the truth was the same, fear made sacred. But among the Persians, something unique endured. The legend of Artabanes became a whispered warning in later folk tales. He appeared not as a traitor, but as a martyr, a soldier betrayed by the king he served, who returned in dreams to haunt tyrants. In one such tale, it was said that his spirit walked the palace gardens at night, his mouth glowing with molten light, speaking only one phrase: "Fire does not purify, it remembers." By the time modern historians revisited the Chronicles, the lead-pouring punishment had become a distant horror, studied more for symbolism than fact. Yet in that symbolism lies a mirror of power itself, how authority disguises vengeance as justice, and how faith can turn cruelty into ritual. The empire that once believed in purification through pain eventually fell, consumed not by foreign invasion, but by distrust and revolt from within. The same fear that silenced rebellion also silenced loyalty, and when fear rules too long, it devours the hand that wields it. Still the image remains. A furnace glowing in a marble hall, the king's shadow flickering on the wall as molten metal drips from the ladle, the moment when civilization calls itself divine while practicing the language of torture. That image belongs not only to Persia but to every age that follows. If you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of it in our world, not in molten lead, but in the way its power cloaks its cruelty and righteousness. The tools change, the metals cool, but the furnace still burns wherever authority fears truth. Artabane's scream may have faded into legend, but the question his death left behind endures. How much pain will a society sanctify in the name of order? And in that question lies the heart of every dark history, not just what they did, but what we are still willing to justify. If this story disturbed you, let it remind you that history's fires never truly die. They wait in silence beneath the surface of every empire, every ideology, every claim to purity. The lead may cool, but memory does not.